All right, Shabbos, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Yoel and Sarah Kelman, in celebration of the completion of Seder Nezikin, and for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. To thank Nathan, thank you so much, David. Thank you. To thank Nathan Perry Smith for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in the schos of the covet for the entire Kehila. We, of course, occurred during the course of the Shiva for Rabbi Howard. We dedicate our learning Le'ilu Nishmas Harav Moshe Yisrael Ben Binyamin. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah's Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Chama. I also want to mention one or two people mentioned to me over Shabbos that perhaps I need to be a bit more hakaras atov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the nisim and niflaos that happened over the course of Hoshana Rabbah. I thought I was makir tov, but it could be that publicly maybe I wasn't makir tov enough. That even though, again, the war is not over, and even though there is still much rain, someone asked, why we still sing Tehillim. So, if you're asking why we're still singing Tehillim, you don't fully understand the enormity of what's happened there. There was an attack against IDF soldiers just last night. The war is not over. The war is not over. Phase 1 of the ceasefire deal has not even been fully implemented. The bodies of our brethren have not fully been returned. It is Nisim and Iflaos, Baruch Hashem, but I'm Mekabel the Musar, and again, if I have not been given proper Hodah, public Hodah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, certainly again, we take the opportunity to say, Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki li olam chasdo, and we thank the Ribono Shel Olam so much for his Nisim and Iflaos, for everything that he's done for our people, for the return, Baruch Hashem, of the living hostages, for the reunification with their families, for the beautiful nisim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does for us each and every day, both national nisim, individual nisim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu does so incredibly much. Just sometimes, you're not allowed to be selfish for yourself, but you absolutely could be selfish for Klal Yisrael. And for Klal Yisrael, you should always demand more of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And for Klal Yisrael, you should always say, Ribono Shel Olam, thank you, but we need more. Thank you, and we need more. For you, for ourselves, we have to be makir tov. We have to be mistapik. Whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives me, I could always ask for more, but I have to be happy with what I have. Ezu asher sameach bechalko. Who is wealthy? One who is happy with his lot. But for your people, be a shnur. For your people, take and take and take and take, and demand everything you can for Klal Yisrael. And even when Klal Yisrael gets a bracha, say HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you hold all of the brachas in your hand. That's it. That's all you're going to give us. That's all you're going to give us. You can give us anything and everything. Be demanding of the Ribono Shel Olam for your people and express limitless gratitude for all he gives you as an individual. So, I thank you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for all of his nisim and niflaos, and I thank you for every single little bit of national and personal chesed that he showers upon us. But halavai HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we should be zocheh to more bracha for our people, to more besoros tovos for our people, for the true end of this war for our people, and Emir Hashem for lasting shalom for all of Am Yisrael. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is Lamed Hey 35. We are picking up Emir Hashem on Lamed Dal. I'm not sure where Rabbi Richter left off yesterday. Perfect, good. So we'll say Lamed Dal on base 34b, 5 lines up from the bottom. And I thank you to Rabbi Richter for giving the shir yesterday. And we'll say a really, really exciting daf ahead of us today. Really excellent. Thank you to David Schwartz for the coffee. Again, coffee is the unsung heroes of the daf. Baruch Hashem. Thank you, David. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh b'dvaro. That wasn't a bracha to you. It was a bracha to Hashem. I just want to be clear. I love you, but I have a karas satov to you. I have a karas satov, but the bracha was for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Good. Let's go. Gufa says the Gemara. Kanya, Rabbi Huda says, Hos echad hay mamalei midam taroves. This is fascinating. This brayso was quoted in yesterday's daf. Where the Gemara said as follows. The Gemara was talking about the idea that on Erev Pesach, so what would they do? And let's remember again, Erev Pesach was the busiest day of the year in the Beis HaMikdash. Not necessarily the day where you had the greatest amount of people, because again, there were other days that had, like the Gemara in Maseches Yoma describes that by Yom Kippur morning already, the Beis Hamikdash was packed, shoulder to shoulder with people. But definitely from an activity perspective, it was the day with the greatest amount of activity. Everybody needed a Karban Pesach. Every Chabur needed a Karban Pesach. So remember again, when we did Mesechus Pesachim, they had an assembly line set up. So the Brisa quoted before, Rabbi Yehuda quoted before, that at the end of shechting all of the Karban Pesachs, what they would do is the Kohen would collect like a cup of blood from the floor, and he would go ahead and sprinkle that on the Mizbeach. Now, what did that do? She'im yishbach echad mehem nimtza shumach shiro. Because he did something very interesting. Let's say it happened that, let's say somebody was bringing their Karban Pesach, and remember again, the way it worked was there was slaughter, right, shchita, Kabbalah, then there was an assembly line of Kohanim. The blood was passed all the way down the assembly line to the Mizbeach, sprinkled on the Mizbeach. The Rabbi Yehuda says it's possible that at some point blood spilled, and maybe someone's Karban didn't end up having a proper Zrika. So what would they do? So it's kind of like carbonic insurance. So at the end of the whole process, they would scoop up a cup of blood from the floor, which was a mixture of all the other blood, right, that accumulated over the course of the day, and they would just do a zrika of that blood on the Mizbeach. And this way, again, if for some reason there was a Karban that didn't get the zrika, this insurance zrika at the end would cover that. That was the logic. Interesting. So the Gemara says, and I will say, by the way, because remember, you'll say to yourself, but 1 second, isn't that zrika happening after the consumption? No, because remember again, when is consumption occurring? When is consumption occurring? That night. Remember again, this is Erev Pesach. Karban Pesach has not eaten till nightfall. So all of this is happening during the day. So whatever it is, your insurance zrika is ultimately happening before actual consumption. Quite fascinating. So the rabbi said to Rabbi Yehuda, 1 second, v'halo lo niskabel b'kli. But 1 second, that blood that you're collecting from the floor was never collected in a kli. Both say, now remember again, we learned this in Zevachim. What's the halacha? What's the halacha? If you shech the animal, the blood spurts on the ground. What's the halacha? What's the halacha? It's possible. You can't do anything with it. The only time you can remedy it is if the blood goes into a kli, then from the kli pours onto the ground, then you can recollect it. So I said Rabbi Yehuda, that blood bepashtos spurted out of the animal, and ultimately again, not into a kli. So why should it be kasha for zrika? So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Amrullah Rabbi Yehuda, v'alo is kal b'kli, minayadi. So Rabbi Yehuda says, how do you know? How do you know that it wasn't received in a kli? Ela shemelon is kal b'kli. Again, what bless you. The rabbi is saying to Rabbi Yehuda is, I understand what you want to do. What are we concerned about? We're concerned that there was a Karban that was offered that did not have zrika. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I have a great idea. Let's go ahead and collect blood from the floor, which is a mixture of all the other blood, and sprinkle that. That way we know that every Karban, so to speak, had its zrika. So he says to Rabbi Yehuda, but 1 second, that's floor blood. That's floor blood. And it's possible that blood spurted right from the animal onto the floor, in which case it's not fit for zrika. To which Rabbi Yehuda says, Amar lahem, top of Lamed Hey, Again, Rabbi Yehuda says, you're right, of course. My whole idea only works with the premise that the blood on the floor was first in a kli. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda says, I'm making the following assumption. Shchita occurred, blood was in a kli, and then the blood spilled out of the kli onto the floor, which then means since it was in a kli, then went onto the floor, it is fit for zrika. Therefore, scoop it up and do an insurance zrika afterwards. The Gemara says, "V'hu gufe mina yada." But 1 second. But how do you know? How do you know that? In other words, how do you know that halacha lamaisa again? It was in the kli. In other words, why does Rabbi Yehuda make the assumption that the blood on the floor was first in the kli? Maybe the blood on the floor was always on the floor. To which the Gemara says is very interesting. So v'hu gufe mina yada. The Kohanim's reason v'avdin hiya u'mishtapchin. Because Kohanim are zrizim. So we'll say this is a principle that the Gemara works with. It's Gemara understands it as a fact. Kohanim are alacritus. They are diligent. They are careful to discharge their responsibilities in the correct way. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, we assume what happened was as follows. We don't assume that lifeblood went on the floor. Rather, what we do assume is that lifeblood went into the kli, and then what happens? In the course of handling the kli, the blood spills out of the kli. You guys hear the difference? And I will say that makes a lot more sense because Rashi says, or the Gemara says, Vavdin hiya. Rashi says, what's hiya? mehera. Remember, Rabbi say erev Pesach, everything had to operate so quickly because of the sheer volume of karbanos that were offered in the limited time window that you had. So by definition, everything had to occur incredibly quickly. So therefore, because Kohanim reason, we could assume they got the lifeblood in the kli. But what happened? Handing it down assembly line, at some point in time, ultimately, again, it goes ahead and spills on the ground. But therefore, because it was in a kli and then subsequently spilled on the ground, it is ultimately fit for zrika. So fasting, but one second, here's the problem. What kind of blood, Rabbi say, can you use for zrika? What kind of blood? Only what we call lifeblood, right? Dam nefesh, not dam tamsis. Dam tamsis is just what we'll call like regular blood, right? In other words, we'll say, what's the difference between lifeblood and regular blood? So lifeblood is the blood that spurts, right? Right after shechita, so that's the blood that spurts out. Dam tamsis is then the blood that trickles out afterwards. So on the floor, the pashtus, you have both of these things. And only one type of blood is fit for zrika, the other is not. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that even damatamsis, interestingly enough, is called blood. Even regular blood is called blood. The sanya, because we learned damatamsis ba'ashara. So what's very interesting, in general, if you go ahead and you consume damatamsis, which is, we'll call it regular trickle blood, not spurting life blood, ultimately, again, it's quote-unquote only a lav. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you're chayiv kares. Now, the fact that Rabbi Yehuda says that you're chayiv kares indicates that what? That he treats damatamsis, which we'll call trickle blood, just like spurting life blood. Mod Rabbi Yehuda le'inyan kapara she'enu mechaber. Rabbi Elazar said that Rabbi Yehuda holds that for kapara purposes that damatamsis is not mechaber, which indicates to us that although from a prohibition perspective damatamsis is treated like lifeblood, but for kapara purposes, which means zrika purposes, damatamsis is not like regular blood. To which the Gemara says, Ki hadam hu nefesh, dam shanefesh yotze ba karui dam. Because for kapara purposes, for atonement purposes, dam nefesh, which means blood that life leaves with, right? Lifeblood, that's atonement blood. Dam she'eino nefesh yotze ba ein karoi dam. Fine, Ella. So we'll say, so now we're back to square one. So you hear our Shaila, right? Rabbi Yehuda has this great idea. What's Rabbi Yehuda's idea? Let's take a step back. What's Rabbi Yehuda's concern? What's his concern? That maybe there was a carbon Pesach that didn't have proper zrika. That's his concern. What's his remedy? So I will say, by the way, such an incredible musar. In life, if you're going to raise a problem, come armed with a solution. Don't be a person who espouses problems without solutions. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I have a potential problem. There was a carbon without zrika. Okay, I have a solution. Scoop up a couple blood from the floor, which is a composite of all the blood, right, that came out that day, sprinkle that, and you could assume that the blood of the carbon that may not have had zrika was included in that to do zrika like that. Gemara says, here's the problem. The problem now that we distill it down is that, problem number one was maybe the blood just spurted from the animal onto the floor, in which case it's unfit for zrika. No, Kohanim's reason. Kohanim are alacritus, they're careful, they're zealous in the execution of their mission, and therefore, again, they caught it in the kli. If it spilled out of the kli. What about damatamsis? That there's other blood that's mixed into that, to which now Rabbi Yehuda says, so we tried to answer that. The Gemara says, what do we do with this? Ella, Rabbi Yehuda tamei da'amar, ein dam mevatel dam. This is very interesting. Rabbi Yehuda says, you're right, there may be damatamsis in there, but one blood does not negate other blood. One blood does not negate other blood. So therefore, again, in other words, you might have thought like this, that essentially, when you look at the majority of the blood on the floor of the Beis HaMikdash, we would assume that it's non-life blood. And therefore, again, maybe any life blood that's there, dam nefesh, should be void, nullified, thank you, nullified. So halacha l'maisa, no, Rabbi Yehuda holds, dam is not mevatel dam. And I will say this actually, by the way, this is actually a good opportunity here. We are restarting Smichas Chaver. Emir Hashem. The new Zman is starting. It's going to be Tuesday nights, Emir Hashem, at 8 o'clock p.m. This week, I think it's going to be Wednesday instead of Tuesday just because of a conflict. But again, stay tuned for that, Emir Hashem. So one of the interesting discussions we're going to have when it comes to Basar B'Chalav is the halacha of bittul, the halacha of negation of different types with each other. So Rabbi Yehuda happens to be the opinion that min b'mino, two like items cannot be mevatel each other, do not negate one another. So therefore, the holds dam is not mevatel dam. So even if there is some dam tamsis there, or even a lot of dam tamsis, the nefesh, the dam nefesh, the lifeblood is still present in there as well. So therefore, most of the Gemara says, Amar lahem Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, again, this marks stand. So this was Rabbi Yehuda's idea. So Rabbi Yehuda's idea is concern. There was an animal, a carbon pesach that didn't have zrika. Remedy for the concern: scoop up a cup of blood, sprinkle that on the mizbeach, and therefore you ensure that everything gets proper zrika. Incredible. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, L'divreichem, Lama Pokikin Ha'azara. So Rabbi Yehuda says like this. So we'll say, now let's go back. So the Chachamim disagree with this, right? The Chachamim don't like this whole thing of gathering up the cup of blood and sprinkling it. But we'll say it's such a beautiful Gemara. So Rabbi Yehuda says, L'divreichem, according to you guys, Lama Pokikin Ha'azara. So we'll say this is incredible. The Mishnah Maseches Pesachim highlights in the Beis HaMikdash, there was a drainage system, right? Which makes sense because you have blood, you have bodily fluids, you have all this, bodily fluids from animals, right? You have all this stuff going on. So they had a drainage system. On Erev Pesach, get ready for this. On Erev Pesach, they would plug up the drain. While they were slaughtering the Paschal, the Karban Pesach, they would plug up the drain. So Rabbi Yehuda says, according to you, now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it makes sense why they would plug up the drain. Why? Because remember, Rabbi Yehuda at the end needs to take a cupful of composite blood. So he needs that drain plugged up. That's what he wants. But according to you, Chachamim, you're not taking that cup of composite blood. Why are they plugging up the drain? So Rabbi said, this is incredible. Amrulo, Shevachu libnei Aaron, Shiahalchu ad arkavosehen bedam. This is wild. So they say to Rabbi Yehuda because it is a shevach, it is a praise. It's beautiful for the sons of Aaron, for the Kohanim, ultimately, again, to walk up arkavosehen could either mean ankles or knees. It is a privilege for the Kohanim to walk up to their knees in blood. In blood. So we'll say, by the way, so wow, like what exactly do you do with that? Right? So we'll say, so just understand, it is a privilege to get your hands dirty when it comes to Dvarim Shebekdusha. See, I will say, a lot of times, there are many things that need to get done in community. And there's the glorious things, right? And there's the inglorious things. And again, the glorious things are beautiful because first of all, everyone sees it, and it's beautiful and it's rewarding, it's fantastic. And then there are the things that again, no one sees, and there are the things ultimately, again, that perhaps are people sometimes even feels like a little bit beneath them. So I'll say like a simple yisod. You walk through a Beis HaKnesses and you see trash. You see trash. It's not my trash. You're right, it's not your trash. Right? Not your trash. But part of the avoda is pick it up. You see a sefer out of place. See something. The idea is there's a beauty in taking pride in the simple avodas Hashem. And certainly, again, I'm using the shul as an example because we happen to be sitting in the shul, right? But lamaisa, again, for the Kohanim, the greatest kavod was walking up to their knees in blood. Sometimes, again, it's the dirty work, it's the little things, it's the inglorious pieces that no one else sees. And we'll see how it works with trash, now it works with a sefer out of place. Everybody walks by it. 1 million people walk by it. Everyone sees it. But for whatever, I don't know what the psychology of it is. I guess someone else is going to do it, right? Just no one touches it. Not that anyone really enjoys touching someone else's tissue, right? But lamaisa, that's where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is. That's where HaKadosh Baruch Hu is. In that act, when I go ahead and I stop and I put the sefer back on the shelf, I put the siddur back away, I pick up the piece of trash, that's walking up to my knees in blood. Those are the inglorious pieces of Avodas Hashem, but those are the pieces that show ultimately, again, that I care. So the Gemara says they plug up the drains, because remember, all of Klal Yisrael sees the Kohanim wading through a sea of blood. Now, if you're a Yisrael and you're looking at that, the Pashtus, what are you thinking? That's gross. right? That's what you're thinking. Like I've always wanted to be a Kohen. At that moment, I'm really happy that I'm not a Kohen, right? Up to my knees in blood. But Elamai, that's the greatest Musar Haskell. Sometimes the most beautiful Avodas Hashem is in the dirty work of Ruchnius, is in the dirty work of Yiddishkeit, is in the dirty work of the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is the true testament to one's commitment. The glorious stuff, the fun stuff, the visible stuff, the stuff that everybody's vying for, that's easy. You don't get such a big shkoyah for that. But the dirty work, the stuff that causes you to have to walk up to your knees in blood, that's where true kedusha, and that's where true growth, and that's where true accomplishment is. Incredible. The Gemara says, "Dam havi chatzitza." But 1 second, isn't the blood a chatzitza? So remembering Rabbi said, this is incredible. Remember, how did Kohanim do avoda? How do they do avoda? Barefoot. And the halach is you can't have anything interposing between your foot and the floor. So lamaisa, isn't the blood a chatzitza? To which the Gemara says is incredible. To which the Gemara says, "Lahu." No, dam havi. Interestingly enough, only something solid is a chatzitza. Ultimately, again, something liquid is not a chatzitza. Disnan hadam v'hadio v'advash yeveshin chotzitzin lachin ein chotzitzin. Blood, ink, honey, milk. Ultimately, again, if it's dried, right, congealed, or fat, if it's congealed, ultimately, again, it is chotzetz. If it's liquid, it's not chotzetz. Interesting. Kamisavi manayu, but doesn't Kohanic clothing get disgusting? In other words, we'll say if they are walking in their knees or even up to their ankles in blood, so that means their clothing is getting all bloody. So again, doesn't that ruins the clothing? Utnan hayu begada metushtashin va'avad avadasa psula. And about the halach is, we learned this already before, that if the Kohen's clothing was dirty, ultimately that compromises the avoda. Okay, so maybe no problem. Maybe the Kohen just pulled up. Remember, Abosai, he's wearing a robe-like garment. So maybe he just pulled it up so that it's not getting dirty from the blood. To which the Gemara says, well, it's incredible. The Gemara says, "Vatanya mido," or mido or mado kimidaso shelo yechsav shelo yosir. The halacha is that the Kohana clothing not only had to be custom tailored to their size, but also had to be worn in a normal way. If you were a Kohen and you pulled up your clothing, that invalidates the avoda. So we'll say, halacha l'maisa again, how are they wearing their clothing if it's getting all bloody? B'holachas eivarim lekevesh delav avodahi. Now, what is it talking about over here when it says that halacha l'maisa, they would walk through ankle or knee depth blood in the avoda? This was carrying the sacrificial limbs to the ramp, which is actually not part of the avoda. Because it's not part of the avoda, therefore, they don't have to have clean clothing. V'lo, is that true? V'atanya v'hikr v'koines hakol zuholachas evarim lekevesh. But 1 second, that's not true. The pasuk clearly indicates that even the walking or the moving of the limbs to the ramp, ultimately again is an avoda. Ela b'holachas eitzum ma'aracha delav avodahi. Rather, the Gemara says, oh, you're right, we're talking about when would they walk up to their knees in blood? That was ultimately when they were taking the wood to the pyre, right? To the pile on the Mizbeach, which was not an avoda. And therefore, again, if their clothing got bloody during that, it wasn't a big deal. So the Gemara says, therefore again, so it's one point what's happening over here. So right, so Rabbi Huda says that they would plug up the drainage system inside of the Beis Hamikdash. Now, according to Rabbi Huda, why did they do that? So that was intentional in order to go ahead and collect the cup of blood. According to the Chachamim, you're not collecting a cup of residual floor blood. If you're not collecting residual floor blood, why do you have to plug up the drain? To which the Gemara answers, why? Because it's beautiful for the Kohanim to be walking up to their knees in blood. Beautiful comes up to their knees in blood. So the Gemara says, okay, but 1 second, then their clothing is getting bloody, and doesn't bloody clothing compromise the avoda? To which the Gemara answers, you're right. When did the clothing get bloody? Only when they were taking the wood to the pyre, P-Y-R-E, on the Mizbeach. And that is not an avoda. Because that's not an avoda, if their clothing got bloodied, it wasn't a problem. Fine. But we still have a bigger problem, which is the Kohanim are walking all around. So how is their clothing not getting bloody during other parts of the service if there's ankle or knee deep blood? So this is fascinating. The Gemara says, Ula avoda hechi asli. For the rest of the avoda, how did they walk around the Beis Hamikdash without their clothing getting bloodied? Azli Itztavi. They built a platform. So I'll say this is fascinating. They lifted the floor. Now, Rashi points out over here, but 1 second. If you're lifting the floor, isn't that a chatzitza between the Kohen and the floor? So we'll say, what would the platform be built with? The platform was built with stones. Essentially, when we think of a platform, what do we think about? You think about like a hollow platform. That's not what this was. Essentially, if you can imagine, the floor of the Beis Hamikdash was made of stone. Essentially, what they did is they piled stones. They what's the right word? They elevated the floor of the Beis Hamikdash. That's what they did. So they took the very same stones, just built a higher elevation. So even though the blood, technically speaking, was ankle deep, the Kohen were actually walking at a higher level. Incredible. And that's how and during the Avodah, that's how they avoided getting their clothing bloodied. Fascinating. Okay. Mishnah. We've actually seen a lot of this already. So the Gemara says, okay, thank you. So the Gemara says as follows. Thank you. So the Gemara says like this. We actually saw this by Pigel, ultimately again, and Chutz Lizmano Chutz Limkomo. So if you remember again, what did we have? We saw the following situation. Halacha l'maisa, if a Kohen has a machshava to eat Chutz Limkomo outside of the prescribed area, what's the halacha? Pasal but no kares. Chutz Lizmano outside of the permitted time, ultimately, pasal and kares. Okay, so now we actually quoted this Mishnah a number of times already. Hashochet es hazavach lechol davar shein darko lechol ulahaktir davar shein darko lahaktir. So we'll see an interesting halacha over here. So let's say we'll just call them Kohen, right? Kohen is shechting the carbon to eat something that is not normally consumed or to burn something that is not normally burned. I'll give you an example. We actually saw this before. Let's say the Kohen has in mind like this. When he's shechting the carbon, he has in mind to eat the chalev. But he has in mind to eat, it's Sunday. He has in mind to eat the chalev on Tuesday. So that's a chutz lizmano machshava. But it's a chutz lizmano mindset with something that is not edible. Right? Or lahaktir darshin darko lahaktir. Or again, he has in mind, let's say, for example, to burn something on Tuesday that's not normally burned. So what's the halacha? Kosher. Now, we saw this already. What does this mean? The sul of chutz limkomo and chutz lizmano only applies to things that are edible and burnable. But again, if you have a chutz lizmano or chutz limkomo mindset for something that is not edible or not burnable, then ultimately the mindset is void. It's just the erroneous mindset doesn't do anything to impact the carbon. Rabbi Elazar says it's possible. Lechol davar shedarko lechol ulahaktir davar shedarko lahaktir. So we'll say, so similarly again, let's see, the interesting case. What happens, halacha l'maisa again, let's back to regular case. Let's say he has a machshava of chutz lizmano or chutz limkomo to eat something which is consumable or to burn something which is normally burnable. But in this case, again, he had it in mind for pachos mikizayis. Interestingly enough, less than a kizayis. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Kosher. So another fascinating fact over here. The psul of chutz limkomo and chutz lizmano only devolves upon a kizayis. So if you have explicit intent to, let's say now it's Sunday, I'm going to eat less than a kizayis of the carbon on Tuesday, which is outside of the permitted. I'm sorry, I should clarify. For the purposes of the example, we're assuming over here that a carbon has a consumption window of 2 days and 1 night. So now it's Sunday, I'm offering up my carbon. I have in mind to go ahead and eat half a kizayis on Tuesday. Right? Burn half a kizayis on Tuesday. Outside of the permitted time, the Mishnah says that erroneous mindset has no impact. Right? Why? Because again, chutz limkomo, chutz lizmano only devolves upon a kizayis or more. Fact number 2. So we'll say, so just keep track of the facts over here. So again, rule or fact number 1 is that halacha l'maisa, the psul of chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, only applies to something that is normally edible or normally burnable. So in other words, if you have in mind to eat something on Tuesday that is not edible, or to burn something on Tuesday, part of the carbon that's not normally burned, halacha l'maisa, there's no psul. It's totally kosher. That's fact 1. Fact 2, chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo only applies to a kezayis or more. And therefore, if you have this erroneous mindset about less than a kezayis, ultimately, carbon totally kosher. Third fact, lechol kezayis, lechol kechatzi zayis, ulahaktir kechatzi zayis kosher. I will say, watch this. Third fact, let's say, it's interesting, I checked my carbon on Sunday. Ultimately, I have in mind, I'm going to eat a half a kizayis on Tuesday and burn a half a kizayis on Tuesday. So I have in mind for half a kizayis chutz lizmano, half a kizayis chutz limkomo. What's the halacha? Kosher. Why? Shein achila v'haktara mitztarfin. Because ultimately, a prohibition of consumption and burning do not combine. So we'll say, 3 important facts. The reason I'm reviewing these is because I will say, again, Zevachim, as we've seen, Zevachim is a beautiful masechta, incredible masechta. It's not that it's complicated, it's just that a lot of times the rules themselves are a bit alien to us because we're not holding by karbanos. But that's why the beauty of a Mishnah like this is once you get facts, once you get rules down, then ultimately everything becomes a bit more digestible. So the Gemara goes weiter. So I'll say, so now that we have our three rules, the Mishnah goes into an interesting discussion over here. So let me tell you what's happening over here. In this case, someone is, we'll call it Kohen is shechting the carbon, and he has a chutz lizmano or chutz limkomo mindset, right, regarding something that is not normally edible. For example, he has in mind a chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo, to eat a kizayis of the hide, mina rotav, from the gravy. Now again, I will say these are the more we'll see. Some of it is, bless you. Some of it is not edible, and some of it really is more like the more secondary parts of the carbon. So watch this. Rotav is like the gravy. Kipa, Rashi says over here, Mefarish Bar Varotav, Tavlin Vidak Dekes Habasar Hashochenes B'Shulei Kedera. This is like the leftover, like little pieces of meat and things like that after you cook up the carbon. Umina alal Rashi says over here is the neck bone. Gid hatsavar shukasha ve'inaroi lachila. This is some type of sinew in the neck, which is very tough and not normally fit for consumption. Umina atzamas, ultimately again from the bones. Umina gidin, from the sinews. Mina karnaim, from the hoofs, from the horns. I'm sorry. Umina talfayim, or from the hoofs. So we'll say, so in all of these cases, I had a machshava. Chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo kosher. Ultimately, again, if halacha l'maisa, you have a chutz limkomo, chutz lizmano mindset with any of these items, ultimately, again, the carbon is kosher. Now, Bosai, why is that? So in this case over here, I'm having, let's say, a chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo mindset for, let's say, to eat the hooves, to eat the horns, to eat the sinew, to eat the hide. We're going to see is these are considered to be insignificant or non-significant parts of the carbon. Because they are non-significant, an erroneous mindset about those parts cannot impact the carbon as a whole. Only, in other words, only an erroneous mindset about a significant part of the carbon can make the carbon ultimately again into pigul. Could be effective. But if you have an erroneous mindset regarding like a chutz lizmano, chutz limkomo thought regarding an insignificant part of the carbon, that does not invalidate the carbon. That's the idea over here. Similarly, v'ein chayav la mishum pigul, v'nosar v'tamei. And for these insignificant parts, you're not b'chayav because of pigul, nosar, or tamei. Good. Hashochet das hamukdashin. If one goes ahead and ultimately again shechts something that is consecrated, le'achol shalil o shalya b'chutz lo pigel. So I will say this is very interesting. Let's say someone shechted a carbon, and someone's like this. Let's say again, obviously we have to be talking about a female carbon, the female animal. And what happens? The person when they're shechting the carbon has in mind to eat. The shalil is the fetus. The shalya is like the placenta. Chutz b'chutz. Outside of the prescribed time or prescribed place. What's the halacha? Lo pigel. Ultimately, again, you don't make the animal pigel. Right? The carbon does not become pigel. So the Gemara says, now what's the logic behind that? It sounds like the logic behind that is because the fetus is not considered to be part of the mother. Right, so it's its own entity. So because it's its own entity, therefore halacha l'maisa, a machshavas pigel ultimately by the fetus does not compromise the mother. It's not compromise the carbon. Similarly, hamolek esatorin le'achol beitzein b'chutz lo pigel. So let's do this. A person is doing malika. Right, remember again, for bird offerings, for bird karbanos, you don't do regular shchita. You do this process called malika, which actually we're going to learn about, which is essentially the kohen takes his thumbnail and inserts it into the back of the neck of the bird, and essentially flicks off his head. We're gonna talk about that process in Mirat Hashem. So let's say someone is going in and offering up a bird, and he has in mind that if the bird has any eggs inside of it, ultimately he's going to eat it outside the permitted time. So what's the halacha? Lo pigel. This does not make the carbon pigel. So both say, I want to point out what's happening. This is an illustration of the previous principle. The previous principle said that if you have an erroneous mindset regarding an insignificant part of the animal, that does not make the carbon pigel. But the Gemara is highlighting over here is that a fetus or eggs inside of the carbonic mother ultimately, again, are not considered to be part of the carbonic mother. Therefore, if you have an erroneous mindset regarding these items, you do not make the carbon pigel. Chalav mukdashin ubeit seiturin ein chayav nala mishum pigel v'no sevatame. Similarly, again, about say something would apply. Let's say about milk of an animal, right? Let's say again, a person had, right, the kohen had a machshavas pigel about the milk. I'm going to drink the milk inside of the animal. Ultimately, again, on Tuesday, or same case of the eggs, right? The eggs of the turtle dove, one is not chayiv because of pigel, no sar or tame. Okay, incredible, Abosai. So now this Mishnah was chock full of information for us. Now let's analyze it a bit. Rabbi Lazar. Abosai, this statement of Rabbi Lazar is very important because this statement is going to be what the rest of the daf focuses on. So Rabbi Lazar, pigel bezevach, nispagel hashalil, bishalil lo nispagel hazevach. Okay, Abosai, here it is. So Rabbi Lazar says like this. If you have in mind a machshavas pigel, so let's take a classic case, right? I'm shechting a carbon on Sunday, and I have in mind that I'm going to eat the sacrificial meat on Tuesday. What do we call that? What do we call that? Chutz lizmano, which is pigel, When I have machshavas pigel about carbonic meat, carbon, then that renders the entire carbon pigel, including the fetus. So if the carbonic mother is pregnant, then again, once I have machshavas pigel about the carbon, even the fetus becomes pigel. On the other hand, bishalil lo nispagel hazevach. If I have in mind that I'm going to eat the fetus on Tuesday, that does not make the rest of the carbon pigel. Rabbi, you hear this? You understand? Rabbi Lazar is saying is like this, and he's just going to illustrate with a number of different things. If you make a primary part of the carbon pigel, then the whole carbon becomes pigel. If you make a non-primary part pigel, then ultimately the carbon does not become pigel. So if you have in mind to eat sacrificial meat on Tuesday, that makes the carbon pigel, therefore even the fetus becomes pigel. If you have in mind to eat the fetus on Tuesday, then that does not have an impact on the carbon because the fetus is a non-primary part of the carbon itself, or not part of the carbon itself. So other examples of this, right? Piga ba'alol nispagla mora. B'mora lo nispagel alol. So we'll say simply by an animal. Now we'll say, remember again, what's the alol? The alol is this sinew in the neck. Apparently by birds, it's not edible, but ultimately, again, by animals, it is edible. So the Gemara says, piga ba'alol. Just the opposite. By birds, it's edible. By animals, it's not edible. So pigel ba'alol, if you had a machshavas pigel by the alol of a bird, then the crop of the bird becomes pigel as well. B'mora lo nispagel alol. They had a machshavas pigel by the crop doesn't make the alol. So we'll say, it's the same principle. The alol is considered to be primary part of the bird. The morah, the crop, is considered to be insignificant part of the bird. So if you have a machshavas pigel about a significant part of the bird, then ultimately makes the whole bird pigel. Have a machshavas pigel about something insignificant, ultimately the bird is not pigel. Pigel be'emurim nispaglu parim. Be'parim lo nispaglu emurim. So we'll see also. So this is actually an interesting case as well. So the Gemara says that halacha l'maisa, if you have in mind ultimately, again, let's say you shechted a par. We'll discuss par in just a moment. You have in mind, ultimately, when you shecht a par, that the sacrificial pieces are going to be consumed or burned outside of their prescribed time. That goes ahead and makes the entire carbon pigel. The parim, but if halacha l'maisa, again, you had in mind by him to eat the meat outside of the prescribed time, that does not go ahead and invalidate the sacrificial parts. Now, that last phrase is going to require a little bit more explanation, which we're going to get into. So we'll say, so this is Rabbi Lazar's shita, right? Rabbi Lazar's shita is essentially, if you have a machshavas pigel about what we'll call a primary or dominant or main part of the carbon, that makes everything, even the secondary parts or insignificant parts, pigel. But if you have machshavas pigel about a secondary or insignificant part of the carbon, that does not render the rest of the carbon pigel. Good. So it says, let's bring the support to this. Bishavim shehishev pigel ba'achilas parim b'sreifasan lo asa v'lo klum. So we'll say, so I just want to point out, remember again, when we talk about parim, so this takes us back a little bit to our hurriest days. What are examples of parim? So two major examples, right? Par he'elam dara minat tzibor, which is, if you remember again, when the Sanhedrin paskind, and they paskind erroneously, and allowed Klal Yisrael to do something which, had it been done intentionally, would be a chi of kares. That's par he'elam dara minat tzibor. Or par koin Mashiach, which is same idea, but instead of the Sanhedrin paskining, the koin gadol paskind. The koin gadol paskind. So says the Gemara, V'shavim shemchi shev ba'achilas parim ubisrei pasan lo asa v'lo klum. Everyone agrees that if halacha l'maisa there was a machshavas pigel about the parim and about their sreifa, so ultimately again such a machshava is insignificant. The Gemara says, my love, hachisha be'emurim nispaglu parim. Isn't that because halacha l'maisa again they had a machshava about the meat, not about the sacrificial parts? But had they had a machshavas pigel about the sacrificial parts, that would indeed render the entire carbon pigel. To which the Gemara says, lo, Amud Beis, lo, hachishe be'emurim nispaglu emurin aspan. No, that's not necessarily what it means. Rather, what it means is like this, that it's possible that had you had a machshavas pigel ultimately about the sacrificial parts themselves would have become pigel, but not the rest of the carbon. Okay, so no raya for or against Rabbi Lazar. So tashma. So we'll say, let's go. Let's finish this up. Tashma. Parim hanisrafim, usirim hanisrafim. Molin bahen mishahuk teshu. Yeah, it sounded like it's like a little ezum makom, which is what it is. So parim hanisrafim, usirim hanisrafim. So both say, so ultimately again, parim that are burned or siirim that are burned. So remember again, Abosai, these often refer to these type of sin offerings. So remember, parim hanisrafim ultimately again, like I said, is parim dav minat tzibor, par kohen Mashiach. Siirim hanisrafim could be like the siirim of Yom Kippur. So what's the halacha? Molin b'hem mishahuk teshu. They are subject to me'ilah the moment that they are consecrated. Nishchatu, once they're shechted, huksharu lipasal b'tful yom or b'mechusar kippurim ubelina. Now, once the carbon is shechted, so what happens? They can become invalidated through a tful yom. Remember again, who's our tful yom? Tful yom is the guy who was tamei, went to the mikvah, but still requires what? Harav shemesh, sunset. If that guy, now what? Remember, a living animal cannot contract tumah. But once the carbon is shechted, ultimately, if a tvul yom touches that carbon, it becomes tamei, invalidated, right? Ultimately, it's possible. So tvul yom, mechusar kippurim, or for that matter, again, someone who isn't a tvul yom but is missing his karbanos. A good example of that would be a zav or a mitzora, who maybe went to the mikvah, have the requisite time, but have not shechted their karbanos. So both say in those cases, ultimately, the halacha is, if they touch a shechted carbon, ultimately, again, they will invalidate it. Or lina. What's lina refer to? Lina is leaving over a carbon. My love linas basar is it's not referring to leaving over a sacrificial meat. Ushmamina migo de pasla belina pasla b'machshava. And I will say, I would assume that once a carbon is ultimately, again, invalidated through lina, through leaving over, then halacha l'maisa b'pashtos should also be subject to invalidation through an erroneous mindset. To which the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. Lo linas emurim. It's referring ultimately again to the leaving of sacrificial parts. Says the Gemara, ha midiktani seifa kulan molin bahen al beis hadashan. I will say ultimately every carbon is subject to me'ilah. Ultimately, again, until it is fully charred on the Beis Hadeshen. So the Gemara says, "Ashitach habasar mechlal dereisha linas basar." From this, I could infer that ultimately, again, the first part of the brayso is talking about the leaving over of the meat. The first part of the brayso is talking about sacrificial parts, and the second part of the brayso is talking about meat. Mosiv Rabbas, Rabbi Zekasha, Ve'elu Shein Mefaglin, Bein Mispaglin. So also the following items, that the Lashon is very interesting. The following items do not become pigul and cannot make something else pigul. Now, both say, remember again, now I understand what that expression means. Don't become pigul. What does it mean? Can't make something pigul? That if you have an erroneous mindset about these items, it doesn't rest of the carbon pigul. What are these items? Semer shebera shekvasim, the hair or the wool on the head of a sheep. The se'ar shebezakin tiyashim, or the beard of a goat, right? Va'ar, va'arotav, va'kipa, va'alal, or again, the hide, the gravy, right? That's the kipa is the residual meat left in the pot. Alal is that neck sinew. Mora is for a bird, the crop. Atzamos, bones, gidin, sinews, karnaim, horns, talfaim, hooves, hashalil, the fetus, shilya, the placenta, the chalav hamukdashin, or milk that is inside of an animal, beit seiturin, or the eggs of a turtle dove, kulan lo mifaglin velo mispaglin. All of these items, they cannot become pigul, nor can they make something else pigul. Ve'ein chayavan alei mishum pigul, no. And they're not subject ultimately again to pigul, to nosar, or to tuma, right? And if you sacrifice any of these parts outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you're pater. So the Gemara says, "My lav lo mifaglin hazevach, v'lo mispaglin machmas hazevach." Now, Bosai, doesn't this sound like over here? On one hand, all of these aforementioned items, if you had an erroneous mindset about them, they themselves do not become pigul, and ultimately, again, they can't make something else pigul. Now, Bosai, this contradicts Rabbi Lazar, because what did Rabbi Lazar say? Rabbi Lazar said that halacha l'maisa, although insignificant parts, if you have a machshavas pigul about them, they can't render the rest of the carbon pigul. But what did Rabbi Lazar say? If you have a machshava about a dominant part of the carbon, then what? Even these insignificant items do become pigul. So this contradicts that. To which the Gemara says, lo mifaglin es hazevach, lo mispaglin machmas atzmon. No, what it means is that halacha l'maisa, these items cannot make the carbon pigul, nor can they become pigul on their own. To which the Gemara says, really? Ihachi, hadik tani seifa. What about the end of the brayso that says, kulan lo mifaglin, v'lo mispaglin? Why does the end of the brayso need to say that they don't become pigul, they don't make pigul about other things? Hasulamali. Why do you need that phrase? Well, the tamech. First white line. Why do you need that additional phrase that ultimately again you're not chai because of pigul? Rather, since we had to mention no sar and tameh, we also mentioned pigul. Tananami, the kulan lo mifaglin v'lo mispaglin. To which the Gemara says, no, but since we had to be redundant, since we had to also mention that any of these items sacrificed outside of the Beis Hamikdash does not generate liability, we also mentioned pigul again. Rava Amar Rava said, Af anan nami tanina. So Rava said, we also learn this. Af anan tanina hashochet das hamukdash lechol shalil o shilya b'chutz lo pigel. Supposed to listen to this. Rabbi said as follows. We also learn this. If one goes ahead and shechts mukdashim, right? So one shechts a carbon, and when he shechts the carbon, he has in mind to eat the fetus or the placenta bachutz, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, lo pigel. Ultimately, again, it doesn't make anything pigel. And I will say that's the Mishnah, by the way. Everyone is agreeing with that. Why? Because again, the logic is that the fetus and the placenta are considered to be separate and distinct from the mother, and therefore a machshavas pigul about those items does not render the carbonic mother pigul. And the same idea, if one does malik on a bird and one has in mind that to eat the eggs inside of the bird on Tuesday, that does not go to make the bird pigul. V'hadar tani chalav hamukdashin ubeit seiturin. Then the Mishnah says again that the milk inside of a carbonic mother, or ultimately again the eggs inside of the turtle dove, ein chayav and shum pigol, no sarvatame. Those are ultimately, if you notice, when the Mishnah restates it, so the Mishnah says that the milk inside of a carbon or the eggs inside of a turtle dove, you're not chayav because of pigol, no sartame. What's missing from that list? The fetus and the placenta. Hashalo v'shaya chayavin. Alalav shmaminar. Here we go. So I don't understand. So which one is it? Is a placenta and a fetus subject to pigol or not? Or not? To which one is supposed to say, watch this. Alalav shmaminar. Kan machmas hazevach. Kan machmas atzman shmamina. The Gemara says it depends. And Rabbi say, here it is. What does it depend on? Halacha l'maisa. And Rabbi say, so halacha l'maisa. Saying like this. If when shechting the carbon, you have in mind that I'm going to eat the fetus of the placenta on Tuesday, so ultimately what's the impact of that erroneous mindset? Zero. Why? Because the fetus and the placenta are considered to be, we'll call it, besides separate and distinct, an unimportant part of the carbonic mother. Because of that halacha l'maisa, an erroneous mindset about those items has absolutely no impact on the carbonic mother. However, if let's say you have in mind to eat the carbonic meat on Tuesday, then what does that Rabbi say? That is a machshavas pigol. And what does machshavas pigol devolve upon? What does it devolve upon? Everything. So therefore, Rabbi say essentially, the Gemara comes full circle and says, we paskin like Rabbi Lazar. Halacha l'maisa pass like Rabbi Lazar. So again, a machshavas pigol about an unimportant or secondary or separate part of the carbon will not render the carbon as a whole pigol. But a machshavas pigol about an important or dominant or central part of the carbon will render parts of the animal pigol. So therefore, again, just one more time, illustration of this. A person has machshavas pigol about the fetus, that doesn't do anything. But a person has machshavas pigol special meat, and the carbonic mother is pregnant, then even the fetus becomes pigol as well. Incredible. That's ultimately, again, the position of Rabbi Lazar, and halacha l'maisa, that's how the Gemara ends off. All right, well, so we'll have to stop over here. We'll pick up Emir Hashem with the Tanan Hassam, Emir Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. What did both say? So again, a lot of information, but again, clearly digestible rules that if we're able to hold on to them in Miras Hashem, they will continue to guide the conversation going forward. And we'll say, what a start to the week. Shkoyach, everyone. Staros Tovos. Yeah, that's what it sounds like. The Gemara says, right. The Gemara says that it's a pure blood is darker, brighter. Okay.
Its blood is blue, arterial blood is red. Interesting. So it looks like
It's different.
it gets
CME credits all.
So raising up the floor, that's not like adding extra doors for the...
No.